There is a particular kind of silence that exists only in the hour before midnight, in the middle of a war. It is not peace, it is not safety, it is something else entirely. A kind of held breath, shared by thousands of men at once, each of them alone with it. On the night of July 11th, 1943, that silence settled over an airfield outside Kairouan, in Tunisia. Dust hung in the air, kicked up by boats and propellers, lit gold by the last of the evening sun. Rows of C-47 Skytrains sat wing to wing on the packed earth, their fabric skins patched in places, their engines still warm from the afternoon's checks. Inside those aircraft, young men checked their gear for the third or fourth time, not because they had forgotten anything. They simply needed their hands to do something. This was the second wave. 2 nights earlier, the first wave had jumped. Colonel James Gavin's 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment had dropped into the darkness above Sicily, scattering across the countryside in the chaotic, half-controlled way that airborne operations almost always did in those early years of the war. It had been messy. It had been frightening. But it had, in the end, worked. The paratroopers had caused confusion behind enemy lines, disrupted communications, and helped blunt a dangerous counterattack by the Hermann Göring Panzer Division near a town called Gela. Now it was the turn of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment under Colonel Reuben Tucker, attached to Major General Matthew Ridgway's 82nd Airborne Division. 1,900 men, 144 aircraft, a 3-hour flight east, skirting the island of Malta, before turning north toward a beachhead that American and British forces had already secured. On paper, this should have been the easy part. The men of the 504th were not jumping into enemy territory. They were jumping onto ground already held by their own side to reinforce soldiers who were already there. The flight path had been planned to avoid the invasion fleet anchored off the coast, the warships and landing craft of the United States Navy, packed with anti-aircraft guns, sailors, and nerves, stretched thin by 2 days of combat. Word had been sent ahead, a general order passed down through the chain of command, informing every ship and every shore battery. Friendly transport aircraft carrying friendly paratroopers would be flying overhead late on the night of the 11th. Hold your fire, let them pass. It seemed like a formality, the kind of administrative detail that gets handled and then forgotten, because of course it gets handled. Of course, everyone gets the message. That is what staff officers are for. Reuben Tucker boarded one of the lead aircraft, a C-53, the paratroop variant of the Skytrain. Around him, men settled into their bucket seats, the weight of their parachutes and equipment pulling at their shoulders. Someone tried to crack a joke. A few men managed to doze, lulled by the engine noise and the rocking of the airframe. Below them, the Mediterranean turned silver and black under a bright, almost full moon, beautiful and also a curse, because a clear moonlit sky is a wonderful thing for navigation and a terrible thing for staying unseen. They had no way of knowing that in the hours before the departure, the very ships they were flying toward had already been attacked, repeatedly, by real German bombers, and that every man on every gun crew in that fleet was now coiled tight as a spring, waiting for the next wave of aircraft engines to appear out of the dark. They had no way of knowing that the message meant to protect them. The order to hold fire had not reached everyone it was supposed to reach. They were flying unknowingly into the most dangerous kind of mistake there is, the one that has already happened and simply hasn't been discovered yet. Most of these men were young, Many were not yet 25. A large number had trained together for the better part of a year, jumping from towers in the Georgia heat, learning to pack their own chutes, learning to trust the silk and the static line, and the man standing next to them in the door. For most of them, Sicily would be their very first combat jump. They carried with them the strange, specific weight of an airborne soldier's kit. The main chute, the reserve, the leg bag stuffed with extra ammunition and grenades, sometimes a folding bicycle or an entrenching tool strapped somewhere awkward. Fully loaded, a paratrooper of 1943 might be carrying close to a third of his own body weight. Climbing into a C-47 in that condition was its own small ordeal before the airplane had even left the ground. Somewhere in the formation, a radio operator checked frequencies that, in truth, would matter very little once the shooting started, because by the time anyone needed to communicate the truth, "These are friendly aircraft, stop firing," it would already be far too late for radios to fix it. The warning, if it was going to work at all, had needed to arrive hours earlier, quietly, on paper, long before any engine ever started. It hadn't, not everywhere it needed to. The people and the plan. To understand what was about to happen over Gela, you have to understand the men on both ends of this story, the men in the planes and the men on the ships below them, and the impossible position both groups had been placed in, through no real fault of their own. Start with the fleet. For 2 days, the invasion force anchored off Sicily's southern coast had been a magnet for the Luftwaffe. German bombers, Junkers, Ju-88s, Heinkel HE-111s, and fighters like the Messerschmitt Me-109 had been making repeated runs at the ships throughout the daylight hours of July 10th and 11th. They had sunk at least one vessel, the cargo ship SS Robert Rowan, and damaged several others. Sailors had spent the better part of 2 days at general quarters, snatching what rest they could between air raid warnings, watching tracer fire arc up into the sky and bombs fall toward the water around them. This matters more than it might seem to, on first telling. Fear and exhaustion are not abstract concepts on a warship under repeated air attack. They physically change how fast a man's finger moves toward a trigger. They shrink the amount of time anyone is willing to spend double-checking a shape in the dark before deciding it's hostile. And then, on the night of the 11th, almost exactly in the window, when the 504th transport planes were due to arrive, there was another German air raid. Real bombers, real bombs. The fleet had been under attack again, just minutes, by most accounts around 15 minutes, before the C-47s and C-53s carrying American paratroopers appeared on the horizon. 15 minutes is nothing. It is the time it takes to walk to a corner store and back. It is not enough time for a man's heart rate to come back down, for his hands to stop being ready, for the part of his brain that has just been bombed to switch back into a calmer, more deliberate mode of thinking. Now consider the silhouette problem. The C-47 Skytrain, the backbone of American airborne and transport operations, was a twin-engine aircraft with a high wing and a fairly thick, boxy fuselage. From a distance, at night, illuminated only by moonlight and muzzle flashes, its silhouette bore an unfortunate resemblance to the German Junkers Ju-88, the very aircraft that had just finished attacking the fleet. Aircraft recognition training existed. The Navy ran a program, developed in part by an officer named Renshaw, designed to drill sailors on the differences between friendly and enemy aircraft silhouettes until the recognition became almost reflexive. Some ships had officers who had been through this training rigorously. The destroyer USS Jeffers, for instance, had an ensign named Donald McClurg, who had drilled his crew on aircraft recognition nearly every single day from early June through the moment they sailed for Sicily. When the moment came, the Jeffers held its fire. Its commander would later credit that training explicitly, and so would the overall American naval commander for the operation, who singled out ships with Renshaw-trained crews for praise in his official report. But that training was not evenly distributed throughout the fleet. Some crews had it, some did not, or had only had a brief, rushed version of it. And training, however good, has its limits when a man is exhausted, frightened, and has just watched his own ship get bombed. Then there is the third problem, the one that turns a bad situation into a catastrophe, the warning order itself. A directive had been issued up and down the chain of command, informing naval and ground forces around Jella that friendly transport aircraft would be flying overhead that night, carrying the 504th to reinforce the beachhead. This order existed. It was real. It was sent. And yet, in the after-action interviews and reports that followed, an extraordinary number of sailors and gun crews, on ship after ship, insisted they had never received it, or had received it too late, or had received some version of it that did not clearly register in their minds at the critical moment. Whether this was a failure of transmission, a failure of distribution once it reached individual ships, or simply the human tendency to forget a routine, administrative notice issued hours earlier in the middle of a chaotic, exhausting deployment, the effect was the same. An enormous number of people who were supposed to know that friendly aircraft were coming did not know it or did not remember it when those aircraft actually appeared. This is the heart of what made this such a perfect, terrible mistake. It wasn't one single error. It was several small, individually forgivable failures, stacking on top of each other in exactly the wrong order, at exactly the wrong moment. A fleet, exhausted and on edge from real attacks, a real air raid finishing just minutes before, an aircraft silhouette that resembled the enemy's, a warning order that had not reliably reached the men who needed it. And underneath all of it, a much larger, almost philosophical problem that airborne warfare itself had not yet solved in the summer of 1943. Nobody had yet fully figured out how to fly large formations of friendly transport aircraft directly over a nervous, embattled invasion fleet at night without creating exactly this kind of risk. Sicily was, in many ways, the first real, large-scale test of the problem for American forces, and the test was about to fail in the most painful way imaginable. 144 aircraft lifted off from the dirt strips around Kairouan that evening. They flew the long way around, out over the open Mediterranean, skirting Malta, climbing toward a fleet that did not, in any reliable and universal sense, know they were coming. It is worth stepping back for a moment and asking why this operation existed at all in this particular risky shape. Because the answer reveals just how much of military disaster is born not from any single bad decision, but from momentum, the way one choice quietly forecloses better options further down the line. The original plan had called for the second airborne wave to jump on the night of July 10th, the same night as the amphibious landings. As the invasion unfolded, however, Ridgway concluded that conditions on the ground no longer required it. The beachhead seemed reasonably secure, and a second drop carried obvious risk for uncertain additional benefit. He recommended postponing or even cancelling it. But an invasion, once set into motion, develops its own momentum, independent of any single commander's late arriving second thoughts. Logistics had already been arranged. Aircraft had already been allocated. Men had already been briefed, loaded with equipment and told what to expect. By the time any hesitation about the wisdom of the second drop reached the people who might have stopped it, the operation had effectively become unstoppable on any reasonable timeline. It was rescheduled, not cancelled, moved back one day from the 10th to the 11th, and sent forward regardless. This detail rarely makes it into the shorter, more dramatic retellings of the jailer disaster, but it deserves attention because it is itself a smaller, quieter version of the same mistake that would soon play out in the sky. A nagging doubt existed. It was raised. And then it was overridden, not by any deliberate decision that the risk was acceptable, but simply because the machinery of the operation had already built up too much momentum to easily stop. There is also the matter of what the men commanding the naval side of the operation actually told Ridgway in the hours before the drop. According to multiple post-war accounts, naval commanders informed him directly that the Navy could not guarantee the safety of his force during the overflight. This was not a small technical caveat buried in a planning document. It was an explicit, verbal warning delivered to the general whose men were about to fly directly over that same fleet. And the operation proceeded anyway. This is not in itself evidence of recklessness or indifference to the lives of the paratroopers involved. Military operations very often proceed under exactly this kind of uncertainty because the alternative, calling off reinforcements that ground commanders genuinely believed they needed, carried its own serious risks to the men already fighting at Jailer. Ridgway was weighing one real danger against another real danger, with imperfect information about both, in the middle of an active campaign. That is simply what command decisions in wartime usually look like, far more often than the clean, confident decisiveness depicted in most retellings. But it does mean that by the time the C-47s and C-53s actually lifted off from Kairouan, there were at least two separate, identifiable moments earlier in the planning process where the risk that ultimately killed 81 men had already been named out loud by people in positions to know, and where the operation had nonetheless gone forward as scheduled. At around 10:30 in the evening, the lead aircraft of the formation crossed into the airspace above the invasion fleet near Gela. Below them, ships that had spent the day fighting off German bombers were still settling from the most recent raid. Gun crews stood at their stations, eyes straining against the dark, ears still ringing faintly from the last engagement. The sea around them was littered with the debris of 2 days of combat, smoke still drifting from at least one damaged vessel, lookouts scanning the horizon with the particular hypervigilance that comes only after being bombed and not yet feeling safe again. And then, out of the same direction the last raid had come from, more engine noise, more aircraft silhouettes, low, slow, and twin-engined, sliding across the moonlit sky. Nobody can say with complete certainty which gun fired first. That detail has been lost, buried somewhere in the noise and panic of the next several minutes, impossible to recover with confidence from memory alone, decades after the fact. What survivors agree on, consistently, across multiple separate accounts, is what happened immediately after. One gun opened up, and then, almost instantly, the rest of the fleet followed. This is one of the cruelest mechanics of friendly fire incidents in any war, in any era. Once one weapon starts firing at a target, nearby weapon systems and their crews very often interpret that as confirmation. If someone else is shooting at it, it must be hostile. The first shot becomes its own evidence. Fear and uncertainty, which might otherwise have produced hesitation, instead produce a kind of contagious certainty. And that certainty is completely wrong. Within moments, anti-aircraft fire was rising from ship after ship, and from shore batteries as well, into a sky filled with slow, heavily loaded transport planes carrying paratroopers who had no weapons to fire back, no armor to protect them, and nowhere to hide. The C-47s and C-53s carried yellow recognition lights on their undersides, a visual signal specifically meant to mark them as friendly aircraft, visible to gunners below. It made no difference. In the chaos, the confusion, and the after effects of the recent German raid, those lights either weren't seen, or weren't trusted, or simply weren't given enough time to register before the shooting started. Inside the aircraft, the experience for the paratroopers was something close to a nightmare made physical. Tracer fire arced up past the windows. The aircraft bucked and shuddered as flak burst nearby. Pilots, suddenly facing fire from below rather than from an enemy ahead, had almost no good options. Diving lower made them easier targets for ground fire. Climbing higher made them slower and more exposed. Breaking formation in the dark risked mid-air collisions, with other aircraft doing exactly the same thing. Reuben Tucker's own aircraft, the C-53, carrying the regimental commander himself, took hits and began to come apart in the air before it ever reached land. After a desperate, half-shouted exchange between Tucker and his pilot, the aircraft turned back toward Jela. Under continuing fire from the ships and shore batteries below, fire from his own side aimed at his own men, Tucker and his paratroopers jumped. He survived the landing. According to multiple first-hand accounts, one of his first actions on the ground was to tear off his helmet and beat it against the hull of a nearby American tank, trying desperately to signal the crew to stop shooting at the sky. It did not stop immediately. For agonizing minutes, the air above Jela remained full of fire directed upward, while American paratroopers tried to control the descent through it, hoping the men aiming the guns would realize, before it was too late, exactly what they were shooting at. For the men still inside the aircraft that hadn't yet reached the drop zone, the next several minutes stretched into something that no training exercise back in Georgia or North Africa had ever prepared them for. Jump masters, standing in open doorways to check the formation and signal the men behind them, watched tracer rounds rise up in lazy, almost beautiful arcs before snapping past at a speed that made them anything but beautiful. Flak bursts lit the inside of the cabins in flashes of orange and white, throwing harsh, momentary shadows across the faces of men who had no choice but to sit, strapped into a metal tube with thin aluminum skin, waiting for either the green jump light or a hit that would make the decision for them. Some pilots, watching tracer fire converge on aircraft ahead of them in the formation, made the only choice that seemed to offer any control at all. They turned back, choosing to abort rather than fly their crews and the human cargo through what was, by any honest description, a wall of their own anti-aircraft fire. Other pilots pushed on, gambling that the formation ahead would clear the worst of it before they themselves arrived, or simply unwilling to turn back with paratroopers behind them who still needed to reach the ground near Gela rather than be carried back to North Africa with the mission unaccomplished. There was no good choice available to anyone in that sky during those minutes. Every option carried its own version of the same risk. The US Army's own official history would later describe the scene in plain, almost clinical language. The slow-moving columns of transport aircraft, it said, were like sitting ducks. By the time the firing finally stopped, 23 C-47 and C-53 transport aircraft had been shot down. Many more, somewhere in the range of 30 to 40 additional aircraft, had taken heavy damage limping back to North Africa riddled with holes, some carrying wounded or dead paratroopers who had never even made it to the jump. One pilot's debrief, written down afterward with a bitterness that has survived the decades intact, put it about as plainly as it can be put. Something needed to be done, he wrote, about friendly naval gunfire and about formations losing each other in the dark. Because on that particular night, he and his crew would genuinely have been safer flying directly over enemy territory than over their own fleet. The human cost of those few minutes over Jela has been documented with painful precision. The 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment alone lost 81 men killed, with a further 132 wounded and 16 listed as missing. That is close to 10% of the entire regiment's strength, lost not to enemy action, but to the guns of their own side in the minutes before they ever set foot on Sicilian soil. Adding in the casualties suffered by the air crews of the 52nd Troop Carrier Wing, roughly 90 further casualties, including several killed and a larger number missing. The full toll of the incident climbs well past 200 men in a single night from a single devastating cascade of small errors. Some paratroopers who survived the descent through friendly fire then had to fight their way out of landing zones scattered miles from where they were supposed to be. Disoriented, often alone or in small isolated groups, uncertain at first whether they had landed among friends or enemies. For some of these men, the night did not end when their boots finally hit Sicilian soil. Scattered far from their intended drop zones, missing entire squads and sometimes entire platoons, small groups of paratroopers spent the following hours doing what airborne soldiers throughout the war became famous for doing: improvising. Men who had jumped expecting to link up with a battalion instead found themselves alone in olive groves and stone-walled fields with 2 or 3 strangers from other companies, working out by whispered consensus which direction the front lines probably lay in. One enlisted man's account, written home not long afterward and preserved by his family for decades, put a number on the disaster that was startlingly close to the official figures historians would later confirm. 27 planes lost by his estimate and around 410 paratroopers killed. He was not a trained casualty analyst. He was a frightened young soldier doing his best to make sense, on paper, of something almost impossible to make sense of. The fact that his rough wartime guess landed so close to the documented truth says something about just how visible, how undeniable the scale of the disaster was to the men who lived through it, even before any official report existed to confirm it. Another paratrooper's recollection, recorded years later, described the moment with a kind of plain, devastating clarity. He could see, he said, that the planes overhead were their own, but the Navy had gotten excited and kept shooting anyway, until 23 planes had gone down. Some of those aircraft managed hard landings on Sicilian soil despite the damage. Others did not. He noted, almost in passing, that even the men of the 45th Infantry Division on the ground had joined in the firing at one point, convinced they were watching a German attack unfold above them. In the days that followed, an uncomfortable kind of silence settled over the incident, not unlike the silence before it had happened. Newspaper coverage of the Sicily landings at the time praised, almost without reservation, the coordination between the Army, Navy, and Army Air Forces during the invasion. Reports from the period described the joint operation as masterfully planned and executed. None of the contemporary press coverage available from that week mentions the friendly fire disaster at all. This was not really a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It reflected the harder, more uncomfortable realities of wartime information control. The Allies had just pulled off the largest combined sea and airborne invasion attempted up to that point in the war, and the first major successful joint British American assault on what Hitler's propaganda machine liked to call Fortress Europe. Announcing publicly that American gunners had shot down American transport planes, killing and wounding hundreds of American soldiers, would have handed a propaganda victory to the enemy and dealt a serious blow to morale on the home front at exactly the moment morale was needed most. So, for the time being, it simply wasn't said. But internally, inside the military's own investigative and historical processes, the incident could not and did not stay quiet. Army investigators looked hard at what had gone wrong, and their findings read like a checklist of compounding ordinary human failures rather than any single dramatic villain. Transport pilots were criticized for not strictly following their planned, pre-briefed flight routes, although investigators acknowledged that at least some pilots may have deviated specifically to avoid ground fire, which puts those pilots in the genuinely impossible position of being blamed for trying to survive. Naval gunnery discipline was formally questioned. The German air raid that had occurred only minutes before the transports arrived was described in the official assessment as an unfortunate circumstance, but also pointedly as one that should have been foreseeable given the pattern of repeated daily attacks on the fleet. The yellow recognition lights fitted to the transport aircraft were noted to have either gone unseen or unrecognized by the men firing. Unnamed ground commanders were criticized for not adequately communicating the incoming airborne operation to the troops under their command. And, in a detail that sounds almost too procedural to have mattered this much, investigators noted that paratroopers and the infantry units already on the ground had not even been issued the same recognition passwords, meaning that even men who landed safely and intact still had to navigate the additional danger of identifying themselves correctly to nervous, trigger-ready American infantry in the dark. General Matthew Ridgway, the 82nd Airborne's commander, did not try to minimize what had happened, but he also refused to treat it as a reason to abandon airborne warfare altogether. In a written assessment afterward, he called the loss of life deplorable and then argued that the hard lessons learned that night could not, in his judgment, have been driven home in any other way. It is a brutal thing to say about the deaths of your own men. It is also, in its own grim way, exactly the kind of conclusion that turns a tragedy into something that actually changes future outcomes. Because Ridgway and the officers around him did not simply file the incident away. They went looking, specifically and deliberately, for every procedural failure that had contributed to it, so that those same failures could be closed off before the next operation. 2 months later, in September of 1943, the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment was given another night airborne mission with an almost identical risk profile, flying over Allied-controlled waters at night to reinforce a beachhead already held by American troops, this time at Salerno on the Italian mainland. It was, on paper, the same dangerous shape as the Hela operation, and this time the outcome was completely different. Lieutenant General Mark Clark, commanding the Allied forces involved, had clearly absorbed the lessons of Gela in detail, because he refused to simply repeat the same administrative shortcut that had failed before. He personally ordered every anti-aircraft battery on every ship and every position ashore to hold fire entirely from 9 in the evening until he personally authorized otherwise. And crucially, he did not trust that order to travel safely down through paperwork and radio relays alone, the way the jailer warning had been allowed to. He met directly with naval and ground commanders himself and sent personal representatives to deliver the message in person to individual units, rather than relying on a single notice working its way through a long chain of command. The transport aircraft carrying the 504th were also routed to skirt around the invasion fleet, rather than flying directly over the most heavily defended ships, reducing the physical opportunity for exactly the kind of mistaken engagement that had occurred at Gela. When the 504th jumped that night, shortly before midnight on September 13th, not a single friendly shot was fired at them or their aircraft. Not one. The same regiment, a broadly similar mission profile, and an outcome that could not have been more different. Not because of better luck, but because specific, identifiable failures from 2 months earlier had been hunted down, one at a time, and closed. This is, in a strange way, the actual ending of the story, and arguably the most important part of it, even though it involves nothing exploding and nobody falling through tracer fire. A single brutal mistake over Gela, born from exhaustion, a coincidental enemy air raid, a misleading aircraft silhouette, and a warning order that quietly failed to reach the people who needed it most, directly produced a set of corrected procedures that protected the same unit, doing the same kind of mission only weeks later. The lessons learned at Gala did not stay confined to the Mediterranean theater either. American and British planners carried forward a deepening understanding that night, airborne operations flown near friendly naval forces required far more rigorous coordination than had existed in mid-1943. Clearer positive identification procedures, more reliable communication discipline down to the level of individual gun crews, and route planning that kept transport aircraft away from the most heavily armed and most nervous parts of any fleet whenever physically possible. Those lessons would echo forward in modified and expanded form through the much larger airborne operations the Allies would conduct in the later years of the war. None of this erases what happened on the night of July 11th. 81 men of the 504th did not survive long enough to see whether the lessons of that night would ever be applied anywhere else. 16 more were never found at all. For the families, there was no comfort in the fact that a procedural fix 2 months later worked exactly as intended. But it is also true, and worth sitting with honestly, that very few mistakes in military history were investigated, dissected, and corrected as quickly and as completely as this one was. The chain of small failures that produced the disaster over Gela, fatigue, a recent real attack, a similar silhouette, a warning that didn't fully land, was identified almost immediately, named without much evasion in the official record, and methodically taken apart piece by piece before the same unit ever flew a comparable mission again. That is the strange, double-edged nature of this particular mistake. It was entirely preventable, made up of small, individually human and forgivable failures, rather than any single act of negligence or villainy. And because each of those failures could be specifically named, each of them could also be specifically fixed. Somewhere in that fact is a kind of grim comfort, and somewhere in it is also a warning that has outlived the war itself. In any complex operation involving exhausted people, imperfect information, and machines that can look like other machines in the dark, it is rarely one person's catastrophic error that causes the catastrophe. It is usually several ordinary, forgivable mistakes arriving in exactly the wrong order at exactly the wrong moment. And the only real defense against that is making absolutely certain that the warning meant to prevent it actually, reliably reaches every single person who needs to hear it. It is worth pausing too on the men whose names rarely make it into the broader histories of Operation Husky at all. The ensigns and gun captains and radar operators who, on that particular night, made the opposite choice. The crew of the destroyer USS Jeffers, drilled relentlessly by a young officer who had taken aircraft recognition training more seriously than almost anyone else in the fleet, held their fire completely. Not a single friendly aircraft was engaged by that ship during the entire operation. In the official report written afterward by the senior American naval commander for Husky, ships whose crews had been through that same rigorous training program were specifically and publicly praised for their fire discipline. It is a small, easily overlooked detail buried inside a much larger tragedy. But it matters because it proves the disaster over Gela was not inevitable. It was not some unavoidable built-in cost of war that no amount of preparation could have prevented. On ships where the training had been taken seriously and had actually sunk in, the outcome that night was completely different. The same moonlit sky, the same recent German raid, the same approaching silhouettes. And a different result because somebody, weeks earlier, had done the unglamorous work of drilling a crew on the difference between a friendly transport and an enemy bomber until the recognition became close to automatic. That contrast between ships that fired and a ship that didn't, separated by nothing more than how seriously the training had been taken, is, in many ways, the entire lesson of this story, compressed into a single, comparable data point. It is also sobering to note that the Gela disaster was not, in fact, the only friendly fire tragedy to come out of the airborne phase of the Sicily invasion. Only days later, British paratroopers of the 1st Parachute Brigade, flying in to capture a vital bridge under Operation Husky, suffered their own version of exactly the same nightmare. Dozens of their transport aircraft were struck by anti-aircraft fire from Allied ships and shore positions, repeating, almost beat for beat, the same chain of misidentification and miscommunication that had nearly destroyed the 504th days earlier. Some of these aircraft, already damaged and carrying wounded men, turned back to North Africa rather than press on to the drop zone. Two separate airborne operations, two separate nationalities, the same coastline, the same invasion within the same handful of days, and the same underlying mistake repeating itself almost exactly because the lessons of Gela had not yet had time to travel sideways from one operation to the next, one already in motion. This is perhaps the most sobering layer of the entire story. A mistake corrected for the next operation is a genuine, hard-won success. But a mistake that is still actively repeating itself in a second operation running in parallel, days before anyone has had the chance to apply what the first disaster taught. That is simply how war actually works, far more often than the tidy lesson learned narratives suggest. Fixes do not arrive instantly, even when the people involved are diligent, competent, and acting in good faith. They arrive on the timeline of paperwork, briefings, and command structures, which is almost always slower than the next operation, already queued up and ready to fly. By September, with both disasters fully absorbed into the planning process, the fix finally caught up to the problem, and the Salerno drop went forward without a single friendly round fired. It took two tragedies, separated by less than a week, and 2 more months of deliberate correction before the lesson was fully in place. 23 aircraft, 81 men of the 504th alone, killed by their own side before most of them ever fired a shot at the enemy. A warning order that existed, that was sent, and that somehow still failed to reach the people standing at the guns. That is the kind of mistake this series is built around. Not the dramatic battlefield blunder of a single commander, but the quiet, procedural failure that hides inside a war until exactly the wrong night, and then changes everything for the people caught inside it. In the next episode, we go to the other end of the war, to a single piece of paper sent by ordinary mail instead of urgent cable that arrived in Hawaii hours too late to matter, and the very different kind of silence that followed it. This has been The Mistake That Changed Everything.